Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. Let's see. Alright. Well, let's begin. So, I am currently reading a book called The Worm at the Core, and I tend to read better while I'm reading aloud. And I thought if I'm going to do that, I might as well read aloud on camera so that anyone who would like to can follow along. And if you don't like reading but you like listening to things, then maybe you can ingest this content that way. So, that's what I'll be doing today. I hope you like listening, and if you do, I encourage you to donate to me on Patreon. Links in the description. Thanks, and let's get started. Introduction. Back of everything is the great specter of universal death, the all-encompassing blackness. We need a life not correlated with death, a kind of good that will not perish, a good, in fact, that flies beyond the goods of nature, and so, with most of us, a little irritable weakness will bring the worm at the core of all our usual springs of delight, into full view, and will turn us into melancholy metaphysicians. One second. Sorry about this. We shall get these technical issues sorted out very shortly, and then we'll be resuming. Alright, anyway, let's see. So, to begin. On a rainy, gray day in September 1973, philosopher Sam Keen, writer for Psychology Today, trundled down the halls of a hospital in Burnaby, British Columbia, to interview a terminally ill cancer patient who doctors said had just days to live. When Keen entered the room, the dying man told him with a touch of mortal irony, "You're catching me in extremis. This is a test of everything I've written about death, and I've got a chance to show how one dies, how one accepts his death." The man in the hospital bed was cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker. Becker devoted his academic career to writing books synthesizing insights from anthropology, sociology, psychology, philosophy, religion, literature, and popular culture to get to the bottom of the ancient question: what makes people act the way they do? In his latest book, The Denial of Death, which he described as his first mature work, Becker concluded that human activity is driven largely by unconscious efforts to deny and transcend death. We build character and culture, he told Sam Keen, in order to shield ourselves from the devastating awareness of our underlying helplessness and the terror of our inevitable death. Now, lying on his deathbed, Becker explained that his life's work had been about coming to terms with the grinning skull looking back at him. Ernest Becker died on March 6, 1974, at the age of 49. Like many visionaries, Becker died too young. 2 months later, The Denial of Death was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. Back in the late 60s, Becker was an intellectual insurgent. He was immensely popular with students who flocked to hear his lectures. However, colleagues and university administrators were not particularly enamored with an interdisciplinary thinker who drew ideas together from all corners of the academic, from the academy, public discourse, and popular culture, and who challenged their academic and political orthodoxy. Becker thus became a kind of academic vagabond, drifting from Syracuse University to the University of California, Berkeley, where his students offered to pay his salary after the anthropology department declined to renew his contract. After a stint at San Francisco State, he found an academic home at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he wrote the second edition of The Birth and Death of Meaning, The Denial of Death, and his posthumously published Escape from Evil. A few years later, in the late 1970s, the three authors of this book met after enrolling in the doctoral program in experimental social psychology at the University of Kansas. We quickly discovered a shared interest in understanding the fundamental motivations that direct human behavior. Our studies and discussions led us to focus on two very basic human proclivities. First, we human beings are driven to protect our self-esteem. Second, we humans strongly desire to assert the superiority of our own group over other groups. But we had no idea what underlies these prides and prejudices until we stumbled upon Becker's books as young professors in the early 1980s. Like the Rosetta Stone, they were to us a revelation. Mixing deep philosophical prose and straightforward layman's language, Becker explained how the fear of death guides human behavior. He illuminated many of the key social psychological phenomena that we had for years been studying and teaching, but without fully grasping. Suddenly, we had a way to understand why we so desperately crave self-esteem, and why we fear, loathe, and sometimes seek to obliterate people who are different from ourselves. Brimming with youthful enthusiasm, we were excited to share Becker's ideas with fellow social psychologists in the 1984 meeting of the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. There, we introduced what we dubbed terror management theory, in order to build on Becker's claim that people strive for meaningful and significant lives largely to manage the fear of death. The audience started drifting away as soon as we mentioned that our theory was influenced by sociology, anthropology, existential philosophy, and psychoanalysis. When we got to the ideas of Marx, Kierkegaard, Freud, and Becker, renowned psychologists were storming the conference room exits. Bemused but undaunted, we prepared a paper for the American Psychological Association's flagship journal, American Psychologist. Feedback arrived a few months later. I have no doubt that this paper would be of no interest to any psychologist living or dead, read one rather pithy single-line review. But we kept at the editor, repeatedly asking him to explain why our ideas were unworthy. Our queries outlasted the original editor's tenure, and finally, a second, more sympathetic, or perhaps more beleaguered editor gave us something that we could work with. Although your ideas may have some validity, he told us, they won't be taken seriously unless you can provide evidence for them. And that's when it dawned on us that our graduate training in experimental social psychology had prepared us to do just that. We spent the last quarter century investigating the influence of the fear of death on human affairs. At first, we conducted the research with our own students. Later, as our theory gained traction, we were joined by colleagues around the globe. Today, terror management theory is widely studied by psychological scientists and scholars in other disciplines as well, yielding an array of findings that go well beyond what Becker could ever have envisioned. There is now compelling evidence that, as William James suggested a century ago, death is indeed the worm at the core of the human condition. The awareness that we humans will die has a profound and pervasive effect on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in almost every domain of human life, whether we are conscious of it or not. Over the course of human history, the terror of death has guided the development of art, religion, language, economics, and science. It raised the pyramids in Egypt and raised the Twin Towers in Manhattan. It contributes to conflicts around the globe. At a more personal level, recognition of our mortality leads us to love fancy cars, tan ourselves to an unhealthy crisp, max out our credit cards, drive like lunatics, itch for a fight with a perceived enemy, and crave fame, however ephemeral, even if we have to drink yak urine on Survivor to get it. Death makes us uncomfortable with our bodies and ambivalent about our sex. Awareness of the inevitability of death could easily contribute to our own extinction if we don't change how we deal with it. The fear of death is one of the primary driving forces of human action. In the course of this book, we will show how the fear of death contributes to human behavior far more than most of us realize. In fact, it drives us so much that any effort to address the question, what makes people act the way they do, is profoundly inadequate if it doesn't include the awareness of death as a central factor. In these pages, we present terror management theory and research in conjunction with relevant findings from other fields, such as anthropology and archaeology. We also illustrate points with historical and contemporary examples. When describing the research, we've tried to avoid academic jargon and minimize cumbersome technical details. We also tried to enliven the accounts of some of the key experiments by describing them from the perspective of individual participants whose names have been changed. In Part 1, we introduced the basic tenets of terror management theory and the two pillars of terror management, cultural worldviews and self-esteem. In Part 2, we delve into ancient history in an effort to address the questions, how did the problem of death arise for our ancestors, and what did they do about it? In Part 3, we consider the impact of intimations of mortality on a wide range of personal and interpersonal endeavors. In the last chapter, we offer some thoughts about the implications of our work for understanding the modern world and coping with the reality of death. Continuing Becker's intellectual journey, our overarching goals are to reveal the many ways the knowledge that we are mortal underlies both the noblest and most unsavory of human pursuits, and to consider how these insights can lead to personal growth and social progress. End introduction. Part 1, Terror Management. Chapter 1, Managing the Terror of Death. Oh, and as a quick aside, I'll probably only be doing Part 1 today, and then we'll move on to Part 3 in the next chapter, the next time I stream. The cradle rocks above an abyss, and common sense tells us that our existence is but a brief crack of light between two eternities of darkness. Vladimir Nabokov, Speak Memory, a Memoir. On Christmas Eve, 1971, 17-year-old Julian Kopecki and her mother, Maria, a German ornithologist, were flying from Lima, Peru, on a plane with 90 other passengers over the Amazon jungle. They were on their way to celebrate Christmas with Julian's father, the brilliant zoologist Hans Wilhelm Kopecki, in the city of Pulapka. I apologize if I'm butchering these names. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning hit the airliner's fuel tank. The entire plane broke apart in smoke, fuselage, and cinders, 2 miles above the gigantic, sparsely inhabited rainforest. Swept from the plane, Julianne found herself flying into the open sky. All was silent. Strapped into her seat, she felt herself tumbling through the air and saw the jungle canopy spinning towards her as she hurtled earthward toward what seemed like her certain death. Her fall was broken by the thick foliage. She fainted. When she came to, she unbuckled herself from the still attached seat and felt around. One shoe was missing, as were her glasses. She felt her collarbone. It was broken. She discovered a deep gash in her leg and a wound in her arm. One of her nearsighted eyes had been swollen shut. The other was just a slit. She was dizzy from a bad concussion, but because she was in shock, she felt no pain. She called and called and called for her mother. No response. She found that she could walk, and so she walked. For 11 days, Julianne stumbled through the Amazon jungle, home to caimans, tarantulas, poisonous frogs, electric eels, and freshwater stingrays. She endured torrential downpours, sucking mud, brutal heat, and the constant onslaught of swarming, stinging insects. Eventually, she found a small creek. Remembering what her father had taught her, that most people tend to live near waterways, she followed the stream to a larger river. She waded into the piranha and stingray-infested water and began slowly swimming and floating downstream. Her state of shock saved her. She wasn't really hungry and felt as if she'd been psychologically muffled in cotton, but the clouds of biting, stinging insects tortured her. She tried to rest under the trees, but sleep was nearly impossible. Maggots took up residence in her wounds. Her insect bites became badly infected. She got so sunburned from floating on the river under the Amazonian sun that she bled, but she pressed numbly on. Finally, she came upon a motorboat. She had the presence of mind to pour gasoline from a small tank on the maggots, killing many of them. After a few days, the owners of the boat found her near their small hut and took her to the nearest town, 7 hours away. She was the only survivor of the crash. We've all heard amazing tales of people who defy death against the odds. The survivors of the Donner Party and the Titanic, who lived through the bombings of Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. Such stories reflect the fact that all living beings are born with biological systems oriented towards self-preservation. Over billions of years, a vast array of complex life forms have evolved, each distinctly adapted to survive long enough to reproduce and pass their genes on to future generations. Fish have gills, rose bushes have thorns, squirrels bury acorns and retrieve them months later. Termites eat wood. There seems to be no limit to the marvelous variety of ways creatures of all species adhere to the fundamental biological imperative, staying alive. If you discover a bat flitting around in your closet and you enter the dark space with a tennis racket to kill it, you'll be in a battle royale, because that creature will fight to survive. Even earthworms strenuously avoid death, as anyone who's tried to bait a hook can attest. You split them in two, they persist. You try to get them on the hook, they struggle mightily. Once impaled, they defecate on your hand. Unlike bats and worms, however, we humans know that no matter what we do, sooner or later we will lose the battle against death. This is a profoundly unnerving thought. We may think we are afraid to die because our bodies will rot, stink, and turn to dust, because we will leave our loved ones behind, because we've left important things unaccomplished, or because we have the sneaking suspicion that no loving God awaits us, ready to enfold us in his arms. But underlying all of these concerns is that fundamental biological imperative. As Julian Kopecky and other survivors have discovered, we will do just about anything to stay alive. Yet we live with the knowledge that this desire will inevitably be thwarted. How did we get into this predicament? Although we humans inherited the basic imperative to survive, we are different from all other forms of life in several crucial ways. We are not terribly impressive from a purely physical perspective. We are not especially large, nor are our senses particularly keen. We move more slowly than cheetahs, wolves, and horses. Our claws are no more than fragile, dull fingernails. Our teeth aren't constructed for tearing into anything much tougher than an overdone steak. But the small band of African hominids from which we all descended were highly social, and thanks to the evolution of their progeny's cerebral cortices, our species eventually became extremely intelligent. These developments fostered cooperation and the division of labor, and they ultimately led our forebears to invent tools, agriculture, cooking, houses, and a host of other useful things. We, their progeny, multiplied and thrived. Our civilizations took root around the world. The evolution of the human brain led to two particularly important human intellectual capacities: a high degree of self-awareness and the capacity to think in terms of past, present, and future. Only we humans are, as far as anyone knows, aware of ourselves as existing in a particular time and place. This is an important distinction. Unlike geese, monkeys, and wombats, we can carefully consider our current situation, together with both the past and the future, before choosing a course of action. This awareness of our own existence gives us a high degree of behavioral flexibility that helps us stay alive. Simpler life forms respond immediately and invariably to their surroundings. Moths, for example, invariably fly towards light. Although the moth behavior is generally useful for navigation and avoiding predators, it can be deadly when the source of illumination is a candle or campfire. Unlike moths, we humans can shift attention away from the ongoing flow of our sensory experience. We aren't inexorably sucked towards the flame. We can choose to act in a number of different ways, depending not only on our instincts, but on our capacity to learn and to think as well. We can ponder alternative responses to situations and their potential consequences, and imagine new possibilities. Self-awareness has generally served us well. It has increased our ability to survive, reproduce, and pass our genes on to future generations. It also feels good. We can reflect on the fact that each of us is, in Otto Rank's lovely words, a temporal representative of the cosmic primal force. We are all directly descended from, and consequently related to, the first living organism, as well as to every earth-dwelling creature that has ever been alive or will live in the future. What a joy it is for us to be alive and at the same moment to know it. However, because we humans are aware that we exist, we also know that someday we will no longer exist. Death can come at any time, which we can neither predict nor control. This is decidedly unwelcome news. Even if we are lucky enough to dodge attacks by poisonous insects or biting beasts, knives, bullets, plane crashes, car accidents, cancer, or earthquakes, we understand that we can't go on forever. This awareness of death is the downside of human intellect. If you think about this for a moment, death awareness presents each of us with an appalling predicament. It feels like a cosmic joke. On one hand, we share the intense desire for continued existence common to all living things. On the other, we are smart enough to recognize the ultimate futility of this fundamental quest. We pay a heavy price for being self-conscious. Terror is the natural and generally adaptive response to the imminent threat of death. All mammals, including humans, experience terror. When an impala sees a lion about to pounce on her, the amygdala in her brain passes signals to her limbic system, triggering a fight, flight, or freezing response. A similar process happens with us. Whenever we feel mortally threatened by a car spinning out of control, a knife-wielding mugger, a tightening in the chest, a suspicious slump, extreme turbulence on an airplane, a suicide bomber exploding in a crowd, the feeling of terror consumes us. We are driven to fight, flee, or freeze. Panic ensues. And here's the really tragic part of our condition. Only we humans, due to our enlarged and sophisticated neocortex, can experience this terror in the absence of looming danger. Our death waits like an old roe, as the great Belgian songwriter Jacques Brel noted, lurking in the psychological shadows. This realization threatens to put us in a persistent state of existential fear. The poet W.H. Auden eloquently captured this uniquely human conundrum. Happy the hare at the morning, for she cannot read the hunter's waking thoughts. Lucky the leaf, unable to predict the fall. Lucky indeed the rampant suffering, suffocating jelly, burgeoning in pools, lapping the grits of the desert. But what shall man do, who can whistle tunes by heart, knows the bar when death shall cut him short like the cry of the shearwater? What can he do but defend himself from this knowledge? This ever-present potential for incapacitating terror is the worm at the core of the human condition. To manage this terror of death, we must defend ourselves. Fortunately, we humans are an ingenious species. Once our intelligence had evolved to the point that this ultimate existential crisis dawned on us, we used that same intelligence to devise the means to keep that potentially devastating existential terror at bay. Our shared cultural worldviews, the belief that we create to explain the nature of reality to ourselves, give us a sense of meaning, an account for the origin of the universe, a blueprint for valued conduct on Earth, and the promise of immortality. Since the dawn of mankind, cultural worldviews have offered immense comfort to death-fearing humans. Throughout the ages and around the globe, the vast majority of people, past and present, have been led by their religions to believe that their existence literally continues in some form beyond the point of physical death. Some of us believe that our souls fly up to heaven, where we will meet our departed loved ones and bask in the loving glow of our Creator. Others know that at the moment of death, our souls will migrate to a new reincarnated form. Still others are convinced that our souls simply pass to another, unknown plane of existence. In all these cases, we believe that we are, in one way or another, literally immortal. Our cultures also offer hope of symbolic immortality, in the sense that we are part of something greater than ourselves that will continue long after we die. This is why we strive to be part of meaningful groups and have a lasting impact on the world, whether through our creative works of art or science, through the buildings and people named after us, through the possessions and genes we pass on to our children, or through the memories that others hold of us. Just as we remember those we loved and admired who died before us, we feel the same will be done for us. We live on symbolically through our work, through the people we have known, through the memorials marking our graves, and through our progeny. These cultural modes of transcending death allow us to feel that we are significant contributors to a permanent world. They protect us from the notion that we are merely purposeless animals that no longer exist upon death. Our beliefs in literal and symbolic immortality help us manage the potential for terror that comes from knowing that our physical death is inevitable. This brings us to the central tenets of terror management theory. We humans all manage the problem of knowing we are mortal by calling on two basic psychological resources. First, we need to sustain faith in our cultural worldview, which imbues our sense of reality with order, meaning, and permanence. Although we typically take our cultural worldview for granted, it is actually a fragile human construction that people spend great energy creating, maintaining, and defending. Since we're constantly on the brink of realizing that our existence is precarious, we cling to our culture's governmental, educational, and religious institutions and rituals to buttress our view of human life as uniquely significant and eternal. But we don't just need to view life in general this way. We need to view our own life this way. The paths to literal and symbolic immortality laid out by our worldviews require us to feel that we are valuable members of our cultures. Hence, the second vital resource for managing terror is a feeling of personal significance, commonly known as self-esteem. Just as cultural worldviews vary, so too do the ways that we attain and maintain self-esteem. For the Dinka of Sudan, the man who owns the largest herd of long-horned cattle is the most highly regarded. In the Trobenard Islands, a man's worth is measured by the size of the pyramid of yams he builds in front of his sister's house and leaves to rot. For many Canadians, the man who best uses his stick to slap rubber pucks into nets guarded by masked opponents is considered a national hero. The desire for self-esteem drives us all, and drives us hard. Self-esteem shields us against the rumblings of dread that lie beneath the surface of our everyday experience. Self-esteem enables each of us to believe that we are enduring, significant beings, rather than material creatures destined to be obliterated. The twin motives of affirming correctness of our worldviews and demonstrating our personal worth combine to protect us from the uniquely human fear of inevitable death. And those same impulses have driven much of what humans have achieved over the course of our history. The idea that knowledge of our mortality plays a pivotal role in human affairs is ancient. It can be found in the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, and ancient Buddhist texts. 2,500 years ago, the Greek historian Thucydides, in the history of the Peloponnesian War, saw the problem of death as the primary cause of protracted violent conflict. Socrates defined the task of philosophy as learning how to die. For Hegel, history was a record of what man does with death. Over the last 2 centuries, these ideas have been taken up by philosophers such as Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. Theologians, for instance, Paul Tillich and Martin Buber, psychoanalytic and existential psychologists from Sigmund Freud to Otto Rank to Robert J. Lifton, not to mention enduring works of literature by everyone from Sophocles to Shakespeare to Philip Roth. In the realm of scientific psychology, the problem of death has never garnered much attention. Even today, many psychologists remain suspiciously indifferent. If you scour the influential contemporary social science tomes that attempt to shed light on matters such as human nature, the mind, culture, religion, war, history, and consciousness, you might conclude that death is not only unimportant, it scarcely exists. This is probably due to the widespread belief that the effects of our relationship to death could not be understood or tested in a rigorous scientific manner. In the post-Freudian era, in which psychology is still struggling to be taken seriously as a legitimate science, psychologists were wary of big, sweeping ideas, especially those involving the impact of unconscious thoughts and emotions on everyday behavior. As experimental social psychologists, we wondered about this. Why couldn't these ideas be framed scientifically and then put to the test? Perhaps the scientific method could be deployed to explain exactly how people cope with subconscious existential fears. We began conducting studies in which one experimental group of participants was reminded of their mortality and another control group was not. We wanted to see whether, when reminded of death, people in the experimental groups would intensify their efforts to uphold their culturally acquired beliefs. We started back in 1987 by testing this idea with 22 municipal court judges in Tucson, Arizona. That's when things started getting interesting. Enter Judge Michael Garner, who helped us out in our first scientific experiment. Judging a hooker. Reviewing the prostitute's case and setting her bail was all part of the day's work for Judge Garner. He came into work in the morning and sat down in his chambers to look over the files recording the usual misbehavior committed during the previous night: drunk driving, shoplifting, disorderly conduct. Then he opened the file containing the prosecutor's notes for the case of one Carol Ann Dennis. The police citation and the prosecutor's report noted that the 25-year-old woman had been arrested a little after 9:30 p.m. on a stretch of Miracle Mile. Dennis, dressed in short shorts, high heels, and a halter top, had stood on the street corner soliciting Johns. A man in his 30s had driven up in a pickup truck and pulled over, rolling down the window. Neither of them saw the unmarked police car lurking down the street. According to the report, Dennis was handcuffed and helped into the back of the police car. She was then carted off to the city jail and charged with soliciting acts of prostitution. Because she couldn't verify a permanent address, she was waiting to be released on bond. Judge Garner closed the file and sighed. He'd seen cases like this before. The typical bail for this type of infraction at this time was $50. Then he turned to another folder, which contained some personality questionnaires that a fellow judge had asked him to fill out for his girlfriend, who was helping her professor with an academic study on personality, attitudes, and bond decisions. One of the questionnaires was a 2-question morality, attitudes, personality survey. First, we asked the judge to please briefly describe the emotions that the thought of your own death arouses in you. I don't think about it much, but I would guess that I would feel very sad for my family, who would miss me, he wrote. Next, we asked the judge to jot down, as specifically as you can, what you think will happen to you as you physically die, and once you are physically dead. He wrote, I feel that I will enter a tunnel of pain and then release into the light. I will notice that my body will be buried and eventually decay under the earth, but my soul will rise up to heaven, where I will meet my Savior. After completing a few more questions, the judge chatted with his clerk for a few minutes, then returned to his chambers to resume his work. How did Judge Garner and the other judges who thought about their own mortality before setting Carol Ann Dennis's bond respond? The judges in the control group who did not complete the survey imposed the average bond of $50. However, the judges reminded of their death hammered Carol Ann, who, by the way, was not a real person, with a far more punitive bond, on average $55, more than 9 times the typical tab. The scales of justice were tipped, if not toppled, by the judges who had pondered their demise. Judges are supposed to be supremely rational experts who gauge cases based on the facts, and indeed, the judges insisted that answering some questions about death could not possibly have had any effect on their legal pronouncements. How then could a brief reminder of death so radically and without their knowing it alter their decisions? When we set up the experiment, we figured that the judges, generally speaking, were people who had pretty strong views of right and wrong to begin with, and we thought that Carol Ann Dennis's behavior would offend their moral sensibilities. The results showed that the judges who thought about their own mortality reacted by trying to do the right thing as prescribed by their culture. Accordingly, they upheld the law more vigorously than our colleagues who were not reminded of death. By setting an extremely high bond for the alleged prostitute, they ensured that she would show up for trial to receive not just a mere slap on the wrist, but also the punishment she deserved for her moral transgression. Reminders of death don't just provoke more negative reactions to those who failed to live up to our values, they also spawn more positive responses to people who uphold them. In one study, death reminders tripled the monetary reward people recommended for someone who reported a dangerous criminal to the police. And the effects of death reminders aren't limited to those we judge to be immoral or noble. They also increase our general desire to fortify our faith in the correctness of our beliefs and the goodness of our culture. So after being reminded of death, we react generously to anyone or anything that reinforces our cherished beliefs, and reject anyone or anything that calls those beliefs into question. In another study we conducted shortly after our research with the judges, we had a group of American students come into our lab. We asked those in the control group to simply describe something neutral, specifically the emotions that the thought of food and the act of eating aroused in them. Those in the experimental group answered the same unsavory, death-related questions we'd asked Judge Garner. A few minutes later, we asked each group to read 2 interviews that we falsely told them had come from Political Science Quarterly. One with a professor who was staunchly in favor of America's political system, and another with a professor who railed against it. In his interview, the pro-U.S. professor conceded the United States had its difficulties, economic inequality was a problem, he noted, and the government had made foreign policy mistakes. But in general, he concluded, in this country, the people, not the government, will be the final judges of the value of what I have to say. That is what makes this country a great place to live freely. The anti-U.S. professor, on the other hand, acknowledged some of America's many virtues, but went on to emphasize the malignant influence of the power elite and the economically motivated and immoral behavior of the United States abroad. He concluded that morality has absolutely nothing to do with our foreign policy. That's why the idea of the U.S. is a promoter of world democracy and freedom is a total sham. He even suggested that a violent overthrow of the present government was in order. All the students in our study liked what the pro-U.S. professor had to say. They found him more knowledgeable and more truthful than the anti-U.S. professor. But the people who had first thought about their eventual death rated the pro-American much more positively, and the anti-U.S. interviewee far more negatively than those in the control group. Since we embarked on this path, more than 500 studies and counting have demonstrated the many ways that cultural worldviews protect us from the terror that the knowledge of the inevitability of death might otherwise arouse. When confronted with the reminders of death, we react by criticizing and punishing those who oppose or violate our beliefs, and praising and rewarding those who support or uphold our beliefs. Participants have been reminded of death in many different ways. Aside from answering questions about death, they might see gory ancient footage, accident footage, write one sentence about death, or just be standing near a funeral parlor or cemetery. Fascinatingly, their belief-supporting responses are uniquely correlated with the reminders of death. This is important because reminders of other negative events, such as social rejection, failing an exam, intense pain, or losing a limb in a car accident, do not produce the same effects as being reminded of one's own mortality. Throughout this book, we will show how effects to manage existential terror affect virtually all human affairs. In fact, concerns about mortality influence everything from the mundane to the momentous: what you eat for lunch, how much sunscreen you put on, who you voted for in the last election, your attitudes about shopping, your mental health and physical well-being, whom you love and whom you hate. But we're not born with this terror. As infants, we are too young to focus on anything beyond being fed and kept warm. Why and how, then, does each human child become embedded in and a defender of a symbolic world of meaning and self-worth? And when and how does death enter the psychological picture? Chapter 2. The Scheme of Things. The scheme of things is a system of order. It is evidently true. It is accepted so naturally and automatically that one is not aware of the act of acceptance having taken place. We seek the largest possible scheme of things, not in a reaching for the truth, but because the more comprehensive the scheme, the greater its promise of banishing dread. If we can make our lives mean something in a cosmic scheme, we will live in the certainty of our immortality. Alan Wheelis, The Scheme of Things. We begin life as diaper-drenching, pacifier-sucking creatures, but we don't remember that time. We know our names, but we do not recall having received them. Yet we have fairly solid recollections of our lives after the age of 5, give or take a year or two. Favorite pets, toys, teachers, friends, unwelcome hugs by overzealous aunts, scoring a goal, summer camp, Halloween trick-or-treating. Eventually, we each become aware of ourselves, not just as individuals, but as part of a broader social context. We become Brazilian, Nigerian, Mexican, Italian, Lebanese, Chinese, Dutch, Mexican, Japanese, or American, in a wider world of meanings and symbols. From the child of 5 to myself is but a step, Leo Tolstoy observed, but from the newborn baby to the child of 5 is an appalling distance. How do we transform from crying, cooing neonates to adults with names and nationalities, seeking significance in our respective cultures? And how does this transition allow us to function securely in the world? Let's consider how this appalling distance is traversed, how concerns about death influence the course of the journey, and what happens thereafter. The need for psychological security. Our early years are very important for establishing psychological security. If they don't go well, the journey toward adulthood can be incredibly harrowing. Consider the case of Cripian, a healthy and cute baby boy born in Carpentius, Romania, in April of 1990. The baby's birth mother, Alin, didn't really want to bring him into the world. He was her fourth child. The government of Romania, under the dictatorship of Nicolae Ceausescu, apologies for butchering these names, had outlawed both contraception and abortion, and Alin and her family barely survived on the chickens they raised in their tiny farm and the few vegetables from their scrappy yard. Desperately poor, she and her husband decided they could not afford to keep their new son. So right after he was born, they dropped him off at a state orphanage and went back to the grim work of keeping themselves and the remaining children alive. Cyprian was one of about 170,000 Romanian babies crammed into orphanages that were like terrible zoos. The babies were barely fed and only occasionally changed. They were never taken outside into the fresh air. The rooms they were housed in reeked of urine and body odor. With a ratio of dozens of children to 1 or 2 caregivers, the abandoned babies were never cuddled. They had no toys to play with. Because they were often tied to their filthy cribs, they didn't learn how to walk or crawl. Instead of learning to talk, they banged their heads on the metal bars of their cribs. By the time Cyprian's adoptive parents picked him up in Bucharest in the summer of 1992, he was failing to thrive, meaning that he'd stopped growing and developing. Physically, he was a shrunken, malnourished 2-year-old. Mentally, he was far worse off. Cyprian was one of the lucky ones. His new parents renamed him Cameron and brought him to America. His new family showered love and care on him. He was cuddled and fed. He learned to walk and grew a normal weight for his age. For a while, he seemed to be normal and healthy. But around the age of 4, he began behaving strangely. He was terrified of walking on the grass, recalls his father Daniel. He developed an obsession for patent leather shoes. He stuffed food into his cheeks like a squirrel. He often fell into violent screaming fits. He broke things. He didn't pick up on social cues. We had no idea what was wrong with him. Only when Cameron entered therapy at the age of 5 did Daniel and his wife begin to understand what afflicted their beautiful son. Cameron suffered from a severe psychological condition called reactive attachment disorder, which shows up in traumatized children who don't have an opportunity to bond with their very first caregivers, usually their mothers. Cameron's disorder was due to a desperate but unmet need as an infant for psychological security. These feelings of security are every bit as critical to a baby as milk and warmth, but such feelings don't come easy to little humans. Guppies are born swimming and eating and dodging predators. Puppies and kittens are fully weaned and completely independent in 2 months. In contrast, human newborns are almost immature and helpless of all living creatures. Fresh out of the womb, we can't even lift our heads or turn over without assistance. Forming strong emotional bonds with parents assures that children get what they need to survive and thrive. How does this happen? For most of the 20th century, psychologists believed that babies love their parents for one reason only: their parents feed them. According to Sigmund Freud, milk produces pleasure, which causes the baby to form an attachment to its mother and to develop affection for her. Basically, Freud thought that as infants we love those who make us feel this pleasure. Later on, behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner theorized that bonding in infancy was all about reinforcement. Whoever shows up with milk over and over receives the baby's attachment and affection because he or she is reliably associated with getting fed. Freud's disciple, Otto Rank, disputed this view of why infants form attachments. He and other psychoanalytic thinkers such as Harry Stack Sullivan and Melanie Klein argued that emotional bonds are forged by feelings of being loved and protected. However, this alternative view of attachment wasn't widely accepted until the late 1950s when Harry Harlow conducted a set of famous experiments. Harlow separated rhesus monkeys from their biological mothers at birth and raised them in cages with 2 inanimate mothers, one made of bare wire mesh and the other covered with soft terry cloth. The monkeys spent most of their time clinging to the terry cloth mother, even when nourished by a bottle mounted on the bare wire mother. In another study, the monkeys were separated. One group was fed by wire mothers, while another group was fed by the terry cloth mothers. Although both groups of monkeys drank equal amounts of milk and grew at the same rate, they responded very differently in novel and frightening situations. When wandering around their cages and unexpectedly exposed to a mechanical teddy bear beating a drum, the monkeys with the soft terry cloth mother scampered to her and clung to her tenaciously. Seemingly comforted, they then ventured forth and explored their surroundings. Interestingly, the other monkeys, rather than making their way to Mother Metallica, hurled themselves on the ground, rocked back and forth, or groped themselves and screamed in obvious distress, very much as the neglected children in the Romanian orphanages behaved. The baby monkeys, Harlow argued, used their terry cloth mothers as a secure base. Once their initial fright was quelled by comforting contact with the soft mother, they regained their confidence. We don't love our parents because they feed us, he concluded. We love them because physical contact with our parents provides comforting security. While Harlow was conducting his experiments, psychologist John Bowlby was developing a companion idea he called attachment theory. The theory was based on Bowlby's psychoanalytic training, his knowledge of primate evolution and ethology, and his studies of young children who had been separated from their parents during World War II. Bowlby proposed that if an infant is to survive, he or she needs to be emotionally attached to a responsive caregiver. Because of their helplessness and vulnerability, fledgling humans are especially prone to anxiety, and separation from attachment figures, literally or figuratively, is the ultimate threat to them. Hence, he observed, it was vitally important for infants to develop basic trust, the sense that they are safe and sound in the first year of life, and they could do this only through the seemingly omnipresent and omnipotent help of people who cared about them. Trust and tribulation. Today, thanks to the work of Rank, Harlow, Bowlby, and others, we understand that the primary source of psychological security in early infancy is parental love and protection. When we cuddle and coo over our babies, they feel secure and emboldened to explore. They crawl around on the floor and happily investigate every nook and cranny they can reach, which is why soon-to-be parents often child-proof their homes. If you are lucky enough to be born into a loving family, it's pretty cool to be a new baby. You snuggle into your mother's warm breast where you receive a sweet nourishment. You are swaddled, cuddled, fed, and entertained. When you pee or poop, the wetness disappears into soft dryness. In your early days, simply existing is sufficient for you to be showered with love and comfort from all those wonderful people who look at you with their shining, admiring eyes. When you successfully grasp a toy or get more food into your mouth than on the floor, it's a blissful occasion for your parents. Later, a first step, a gurgling approximation of mommy or daddy, or bouncing a tennis ball off the dog's head evokes effulsive displays of pride and affection from your adult fans. As you become a toddler, it takes a bit more work for you to elicit these sorts of pleasurable parental reactions, especially when you do things mom or dad doesn't like. You might put dirt in your mouth. You might pee in the fishbowl instead of the toilet. You might chase a runaway ball into the street, and when you're corrected, it's not pleasant. If mom pulls your grabbing hands away from the candy counter or stops you from pulling the dog's tail, you become decidedly unhappy. You scream and wail. To stay in their parents' good graces, children must learn to do things they do not want to do, and to do things they do not want to do. Sometimes the stakes are literally life and death. Tumbling off the diving board of the family swimming pool can make for a hasty departure from the family gene pool. Long before youngsters are mature enough to be persuaded by reason to abstain from risky, unpleasant, or socially unacceptable behaviors, parents use approval to promote preferred actions and disapproval to deter undesirable ones. When our children do what we want them to, we praise and reward them. Our approval keeps our kids feeling safe and secure. But when they behave inappropriately, as they inevitably do, we parents respond with rebukes, timeouts, physical punishment, or the stark absence of approval. Confronted by these disturbingly stern adult behaviors, little boys and girls feel upset, anxious, sometimes terrified. In his exquisite rendering of a growing self-image in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, James Joyce's little boy protagonist, Stephen, fearfully hides under the table. Why? Because the boy has declared that when they were grown up, he was going to marry Eileen. Eileen, as it turns out, is the neighboring child of a Protestant family, anathema to Stephen's strictly Catholic one, and if the child doesn't apologize for wanting to marry a Protestant, warns his Aunt Dante, the eagles will come and pull out his eyes. The petrified youngster repeats this threat in his head like a chant. Apologize, pull out his eyes. Pull out his eyes, apologize. What could be worse than being attacked or abandoned by your security base? Even at this early age, Stephen learns that if he doesn't behave the way his family expects him to, he won't be rewarded with warmth and approval. Instead, he will be brutally attacked. In this fashion, over time, being a good boy or girl becomes associated with protection as well and well-being, while being a bad girl or boy becomes associated with anxiety and vulnerability. This is why we all need self-esteem, to feel that we are good and valued, and why self-esteem is essential for managing our terror of death. Soaking up the scheme of things. As they become attached and socialized, children are absorbing the cultural scheme of things. Most children are thoroughly ensconced in their worldviews by the age of 5, although it was a little tougher for Cameron because he missed out on that first experience of basic trust. Cameron was, however, still a lucky little boy. He was able to catch up in the immersion process with the help of psychological counseling and some special schools where wonderful teachers taught him to read and write, add and subtract, and manage his many difficult mood swings. Meanwhile, he enjoyed the usual benefits of growing up in a loving home. Cameron's parents were politically moderate, middle-class people who believed in hard work, community involvement, and helping others who were less fortunate than they. His parents sang to him and read him Goodnight Moon and The Velveteen Rabbit. Cameron learned the names of his relatives, his teachers, the people at church, and his friends, as well as the names of plants, animals, and inanimate objects. He reached out to explore his world. He watched Disney movies and enjoyed rides at Disney World. He slid down the twisty slides at the park and played tag with the waves at the beach. When his parents discovered that he was happiest when dancing and singing, they paid for lessons. Cameron learned to say the Pledge of Allegiance and sing the Star-Spangled Banner. In his Cub Scout troop, he learned the proper way to fold the American flag. On Sundays, his parents took him to church where he attended Sunday school, and the teacher taught him about the stories of Moses and Jesus. At Easter, Cameron went hunting for candy eggs before going to church. He took part in the annual Christmas pageant and had his picture taken with Santa, who miraculously listened to his wishes and showered him with the toys he wanted most on Christmas morning. He learned that weddings are about people celebrating love, funerals are about saying goodbye to people who die, graduations are for people who are finishing school. His birthdays were for celebrating the passage of time, which he came to perceive in the way his American culture diced it up, into an orderly succession of recurring seconds, minutes, hours, days, and months in an ongoing procession of years. Every time Cameron's parents took him to the school, church, or psychiatrist, every time he watched a movie or overheard his parents talking, Cameron received signals about what was good and what was bad. The world was easily divided into black and white. Cinderella and Batman were good, Cruella de Vil and the Wicked Witch of the West were bad. Exercise was good, smoking was bad. Counting to 10 was good, screaming and throwing tantrums when you lost patience was bad. His relatives were good, terrorists were bad. Once Cameron began to sort out good from bad, right from wrong, he began to feel more relaxed. Secure in his knowledge, he felt increasingly in command of himself, for his social world reinforced what his parents had tried to teach him. Gradually, often deliberately, and sometimes unconsciously, Cameron's parents conveyed the scheme of things, as they understood it, to their young charge as he grew. They passed on their own worldview and their understanding of right and wrong to him. Their worldview dictated just about everything Cameron learned about reality, and he began to internalize that he was learning. And everywhere he looked, Cameron's understanding of his cultural worldview was buttressed by emblems, banners, pictures of presidents, and other images of physical objects that represented the commonly held values of American society. He noticed that people saluted flags and visited monuments erected by historical figures and events. The names of good citizens were inscribed on everything from street signs and freeways to the ornate government buildings, all attesting to an overarching political scheme of things. He saw that skyscrapers, parks, schools, streets, and public buildings were named after wealthy benefactors who verified and affirmed the public scheme of things. He saw crosses on churches and stars of David on synagogues that attested the religious scheme of things. All these confirmed Cameron's sense of reality. In short, Cameron's parents and everyone and everything else around him conferred on him a certain description of reality, one that Cameron, like all children, didn't just passively accept but ardently embraced. When children learn to be good and feel valued as prescribed by their culture, the same psychological benefits were originally afforded by their parents' love and protection are extended and expanded. At every age, we humans need that sense of security to survive and flourish, because the terrors are legion. How children discover death. Even before children are fully aware of what they are frightened of, their faith in a worldview that provides order, purpose, and significance helps them manage their fear. This has everything to do with the problem of death. Thrust from the comfortable, warm wash of the womb, babies are frequently plagued by pains, hunger pains, chills, rashes, and a panoply of other problems. Although infants and toddlers don't know what they are afraid of or why, they react with distress to many potential threats to their survival. As children become aware of themselves, typically between 18 and 24 months, their budding grasp of their smallness and vulnerability makes them increasingly terrified by even more real and imagined dangers. They are scared of the dark, strangers, big dogs, monsters, and ghosts. From their point of view, all are real threats to survival. By around age 3, the grim handmaiden of self-consciousness, death awareness, begins to make her appearance. Rocks seem to last forever, but living things are impermanent and can disappear in death. Children may encounter a maggot-ridden squirrel on a path. They may see grandma covered with a sheet and being carted out of the house. A first goldfish or the beloved dog dies. Maybe mom and dad bury Fido with all the appropriate funeral rites in the backyard. Soon after children become aware of death, it dawns on them that they could die too. As they ponder their own existence, they begin to realize that they also could not exist. They become little hamlets as, over time, specific childhood fears coalesce into a general fear of no longer existing. Most of us can remember having nightmares as young children. Nightmares and night terrors are vivid manifestations of a child's emerging knowledge of vulnerability and death. One of us recalls having the following recurring nightmare around the age of 5. A gory purple creature with one huge bloodshot eye emerges from under my bed. I leap up and slam into my bedroom door. Somehow I escape into the hallway with the slobbering cyclops in hot pursuit. I cut across the living room, hurdle the couch, and scramble into the kitchen. The enraged monster is roaring and spewing green slime as it lumbers ever closer. I think I get a knife, but there's no time. In panic, I hide in the broom closet, holding my breath. Suddenly, the closet door bursts open. Each time he dreamed this, he woke up terrified in a cold sweat. But he was quickly comforted, either by his dad leaning over him saying, "Everything is okay, it was just a bad dream, you're a good boy, I'll never let anything happen to you," or by simply realizing that mom and dad were sleeping in the next room as if they would always be there. In childhood, we all awoke from such nightmares with great relief. The monster was no longer chasing you. You were safe. Mom and dad loved you, and everything was all right. In nightmares, the feeling that someone or something is hiding under the bed, breaking in through a window, or suddenly materializing out of nowhere is common. Such terrors reflect a dawning awareness of the precariousness and fragility of life. Although most people remember some fearful moments from childhood, few of us recall being haunted by feelings of smallness and vulnerability. The threat of annihilation, the realization that death is inevitable, and the ensuing dread. Still, evidence suggests that children as young as 3 are aware of and uncomfortable about death, and that they begin to employ rudimentary versions of some of the same terror management strategies that they will come to rely on as adults. In the late 1960s and the early 1970s, British educational psychologist Sylvia Anthony worked with mothers to conduct interviews with their own children. She found that even very young children who were concerned about death. When 3-year-old Jane asked if dead people come back again in the spring like flowers, her mother, who had no orthodox religious beliefs, answered that they did not return the same, but possibly came back as babies. Jane was worried by this answer because she hated change and didn't like the fact that her grandmother, Nan, was getting old. "Will Nan die?" the little girl asked. "Yes," said the mother. Jane broke into heartbreaking tears, repeating over and over, "But I don't want to die, I don't want to die." As children mature cognitively, their understanding of death deepens, and the ways they manage their terror become more elaborate. At bath time, according to the mother of 5-year-old Richard, as he swam up and down in his bath, he played with the possibility of never dying. "I don't want to be dead, ever. I don't want to die." Here's an exchange Anthony recorded between 5-year-old Theodore and his mother. Theodore: "Do animals come to an end too?" Mother: "Yes, animals come to an end too. Everything that lives comes to an end." Theodore: "I don't want to come to an end. I should like to live longer than anybody on earth." In another study, researchers interviewed children between the ages of 8 and 12, asking them what they were typically afraid of and worried about. Researchers also interviewed the children's mothers. Although mothers said that their children were more afraid of snakes and poor grades than getting sick or dying, the children themselves said that they were more afraid of illness and death than serpents and bad report cards. It turns out that children are much more troubled about death, and at a much earlier age than most of us realize. Dodging death. According to the great developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, children's conceptions of death typically vary with their stage of cognitive development. Young children often initially view death as a sleep-like suspended animation. They think, "I go to sleep at night, but I will wake up in the morning." Or, "Grandma may be old and nap a lot in her old recliner, but she always wakes up." Everyone wakes up from naps and nightly slumbers, and sooner or later returns from the lengthiest ones. Accordingly, children sometimes expect the dead to be reborn at a seasonably auspicious moment. They might pour water on deceased creatures in an effort to bring them back to life. Children also use all kinds of mental tricks to dodge death, starting by simply declining to think about it. 3-year-old Jean, in her budding awareness of death, worriedly asked her mother whether dead people opened their eyes again, whether they spoke, ate, and wore clothes. Suddenly, in the middle of all these questions and tears, her mother reported, she said, now I will go on with my tea." Similarly, after his mother told 5-year-old Richard that he wouldn't die for a long time, the little boy smiled and said, "That's all right, I've been worried, and now I can get happy." Then he said he would like to dream about shopping and buying things. These diversionary tactics are strikingly similar to what happens when adults think about dying themselves. They react by trying to stop thinking about death and distracting themselves with mundane concerns. Research finds that after a reminder of death, adults also search for "don't worry, be happy" thoughts, and it is quite common for adults to reach to thoughts of death by turning to comfort foods and luxury goods. "Let's do lunch and go shopping." Children also plan to stay young forever. They tell themselves, "Only old people die, and I'm not old. Therefore, as long as I stay young, I won't die." Peter Pan, the boy who never grew up, is a classic example of this gambit from the children's literature. The late entertainer Michael Jackson, the boy who never grew up in his Neverland estate, is a haunting illustration of this ploy from real life. In many children's stories, death is personified in bad characters. Wicked witches, goblins, trolls, ogres, and the like put shapes and faces on mortal terror. They make the idea of death, something abstract and difficult to imagine, concrete and manageable. Giving death a human form makes it easier to circumvent. If death were a person, he or she could be reasoned with, bargained with, tricked, or overwhelmed by one's own superior wit or strength, or that of a magical intercessor. Between the ages of 5 and 9, children think of death as avoidable if you are swift or smart enough to avoid getting caught. Indeed, in many fairy tales, child heroes often evade death in clever ways. Think of the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen's Compendium, overflowing with mortal threats which children rarely succumb to, or The Wizard of Oz, in which Dorothy escapes certain death at the hands of the Wicked Witch. Pinocchio transforms from a wooden puppet into a real boy, while Harry Potter's clever wizardry saves him from the attacks of his mortal enemy Lord Voldemort, whose very name recalls the French phrase Voldemort, meaning flee from death. A complementary death-denying strategy is the belief in a personal and personified savior. From a child's perspective, parents are gigantic and seemingly all-powerful beings with a knack for showing up whenever bodily or emotional needs arise. It's natural, therefore, for a young mind to also believe in stories about omnipotent beings interceding in matters of life and death. Neither Snow White nor Sleeping Beauty is really dead. They are merely waiting to be saved through the affection of a protective, rescuing, paternal caregiver. Though Jesus suffered terribly on the cross, he didn't really die. God interceded to take him up to heaven. In doing so, he saves you, Mom and Dad, Grandma and Grandpa, and all those you love from eternal death. And after all of you die, you will meet again in heaven. Given comfort from parents and encouragement from the stories of their culture, children can become expressly confident in their personal inviolability. It's not uncommon to hear young children suddenly exclaim that they will never die. At age 6, one of our own kids was not so certain, but was nonetheless hopeful. My 3 wishes, he declared, would be to never die, to be the richest person in the world, and have all the video games. Too deep for tears. As children mature, they eventually become savvy enough to realize that death is inevitable and irrevocable. One day, they realize that the stomped-upon worm on the sidewalk will wiggle no more. Grandpa isn't napping in his underground box as he did in his chair in the living room. The dog that had cancer and had to be put to sleep will not be waking up anytime soon. Suddenly, you grasp the horrible truth. Death is not just an unfortunate accident that occasionally befalls the aged, the hapless, and the wicked. Sooner or later, you realize, death will happen to everyone, including you. The curtain will surely fall on you while you are strutting across the earthly stage, and your ultimate fate will be the same as that of the disemboweled squirrel splattered on the roadside, or that skeleton you so fear. This realization is momentous. Nothing was more difficult for me in childhood than to admit the notion of death as a state applicable to my own being, wrote poet William Wordsworth. Such thoughts often lie too deep for tears. In this instant, you become fully human. Once children understand that they, as well as their mothers and fathers, are perpetually vulnerable and ultimately finite, they shift from their parents to their culture as the primary source of psychological equanimity. Deities and social authorities and institutions now appear to be more stable and enduring than our all too mortal and therefore all too vulnerable parents, grandparents, and pets. Research conducted by our Israeli colleagues, the late Victor Florian and Mario Mikluinser, support this account of how children's burgeoning awareness of death instigates a shift from their parents to their culture. The researchers surveyed 2 groups of Israeli children, ages 7 and 11. Half of each group of children was asked 26 open-ended questions related to death. The questions included queries such as, does a dead man know what is happening to him, and will every man die at some time? Next, all of the children looked at pictures of other children who were the same age and gender. Each picture was accompanied by the child's name and his or her birthplace. Some of the pictures were of Israeli-born children, others were of Russian immigrant children. In Israel, Russian immigrants are stereotyped as cultural outsiders. For each picture, the children rated how willing they would be to play with the child and be his or her best friend. The results of this study showed that the 7-year-olds had not yet transferred their psychological eggs to their cultural basket. After being asked about death, the younger children reacted more negatively to pictures of both Israeli and Russian children. They were afraid of death, but they had not yet deployed their culture to manage their fear. It was a different story for the 11-year-olds, however. After being asked about death, these older children were more eager to befriend fellow Israeli children and rejected the idea of befriending the Russians. In short, the 11-year-olds reacted to reminders of the mortality in the same way that adults do. Having realized that death is inevitable and irreversible, they pledged permanent psychological allegiance to their culture. Rally round the flag. The pattern observed in the 11-year-old Israeli children has been found consistently in adults from many nations. As we have already seen in Chapter 1, Americans reminded of death had more positive reactions to those who praised the United States and more negative reactions to those who criticized it. Similarly, Italians reminded of death viewed Italy more favorably and felt a stronger bond with fellow Italians. Moreover, although Germans interviewed in front of a retail shop showed no particular preference for things German, those interviewed in front of a cemetery preferred German food, German cars, and German vacation spots to foreign alternatives. So let's imagine Steve, a fully acculturated young American adult. If we visited his Facebook page, we might learn that Steve was many things: a rock guitarist in a band, a good son, nephew, brother, and grandson, a high school graduate, an independent voter who believes in equal rights for all, a college student, a man with a plan to become a teacher, and so on. Like most young adults, Steve has transferred his loyalty from his parents to the surrounding culture, cementing his belief systems and bolstering them with new devotions to groups to which he wants to belong. And in doing so, Steve is fortifying the psychological armor against the existential terror that he's been developing since childhood. Now imagine that you are Steve, and you're studying psychology at a major American university. As part of one course, you're asked to participate in some research. When you show up to the lab at the appointed time, the researcher tells you the experiment is about the link between personality and creativity. A lot of personality research has been done on members of the armed forces, she says. During military exercises in the California desert, military personnel were observed using common military objects in creative ways for tasks such as filtering sand from abrasive fluids and creating innovative construction tools. Preliminary findings from the military population show connections between personality and creativity, and we are now interested in generating data on the general population. Here you go, she continues, handing you a packet. Please take some time to complete the questionnaires. When you're finished, come out into the hallway. You're in the experimental condition. You fill out a little questionnaire about personality, and then you're confronted with the same nasty questions the judges that were described in Chapter 1 answered. Please describe the emotions the thought of death arouses in you, and jot down what you think will happen to you as you physically die and once you are physically dead. When you're through the same questionnaires, the experimenter takes you into another room where you see lots of objects sitting on a table: a package of hot chocolate mix, 2 plastic tubes, a thin rope, a paperclip, a compass watch, a rubber band, netting, a glass jar, a cup filled with black dye, a nail, a cup filled with sand, a small flag, and a sturdy crucifix. The experimenter pours the black dye into the sand. She then tells you your tasks: to figure out a way to separate the sand from the black dye, because soldiers had used ordinary objects to separate out sand from noxious substances, and to hang the crucifix on the wall, because fastening things to walls is a common task in the service, but hammers aren't always available. You think about the task for a minute, then realize that you can use the flag to strain the dye from the sand and the crucifix to bang the nail into the wall. But this thought makes you decidedly reluctant and tense. After all, you've been taught to revere these symbolic objects from the time you were a little boy. It feels like desecration to use them in this way, but you realize that you really don't have any other choice. None of the other objects will serve you. Slowly you pick up the flag, put it over top the glass jar, and pour the black dyed sand over it, filtering the ink into the jar. The time elapsed 6 minutes. When this is finished, you turn to the next task. You slowly take up the crucifix and the nail and walk to the wall. You hesitate for several seconds, thinking about how you're using this sacred object for such a mundane task. This is sacrilege, you think, and let out a deep sigh. Then you slowly begin hammering. Time elapsed 6 minutes. There were 3 other versions of the experiment that served as control conditions. In one, the students were asked innocuous questions about watching television rather than ones about death. In 2 others, students were asked about either death or television, but then on the table, instead of a flag, there was a plain old white cloth. In addition to the crucifix, a solid wooden block. In these latter 2 conditions, the students could solve the problems without using the cultural symbols inappropriately. As expected, the white cloths and the wood blocks made for quick, easy, and stress-free solutions to the problems of filtering and nailing. Even students in the group who'd been asked to think about death beforehand had no problem with that, and those who answered innocuous questions had to use the flag and crucifix did so fine too. In the control conditions, it took 3 minutes on average to get each job done. But those like Steve, who had thought about death and had to violate culturally sacred objects, took more than twice as long. They also said that they found the problems were very difficult and felt considerable tension in trying to solve them. The findings of this study established the cultural icons that keep mortal terror at bay. Indeed, cultural beliefs would be fleeting and unsustainable without visible symbols and tangible icons that are imbued with extraordinary significance. William Carney served the 54th Massachusetts Voluntary Infantry in July 18, 1863, assault on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina, where he was wounded. Later on, Carney received a medal for the simple act of holding the American flag up off the ground while the Union troops charged. Afterwards, Carney modestly said, "Boys, I only did my duty. The old flag never touched the ground." Rousing the worm at the core. If the cultural scheme of things helps to banish the dread of death, what happens when cherished beliefs are called into question? Do thoughts of death creep closer to consciousness? Let's say you're strolling down the street on a sunny summer's day to meet a friend for lunch. As you walk, you are enjoying the sights and sounds of the neighborhood. You pass a women's clothing boutique with a sale rack outside, a bookshop announcing an author's reading, a drugstore, an insurance company, and a Starbucks coffee shop. Passing the Starbucks, you briefly note the delicious smell of coffee, but you quickly forget it. A few moments later, you see a woman holding a baby, and the baby makes you smile. As you walk on, you see two people talking, one holding a clipboard. Oh no, oh, not someone else asking me to sign a petition, you think. As you pass, you hear a snippet of their conversation. Just fill these word stems with the first word that pops into your mind, says the woman holding the clipboard. She passes it to the fellow listening to her, who smiled. Intrigued, you stop and watch for a minute as he jots down his answers, then passes the clipboard back to her. Thanks, she says. You're curious. What are you up to? You ask casually. I'm a graduate student helping to conduct a study of associative thinking, she says cheerfully. We're asking people to fill in the following words. Would you like to help out? Sure, you say. Here are some of the words. COFF and 2 spaces. SK, 2 spaces and an L. GR and 3 spaces. At any given moment, some thoughts pop into consciousness more easily than others. Recent, even subconscious experiences make thoughts related to them more accessible. Highly accessible thoughts come to mind quite readily. They are, as it were, close to consciousness. Since you happen to walk by a Starbucks, you might complete the word stems as coffee, skill, grind. But let's say you passed a funeral parlor instead of a Starbucks on your way. In that case, you would more likely complete the word stems as coffin, skull, grave. We constructed a list of 20 word stems, 6 of which could be completed with either death-related words or non-death-related words. We figured that the more death-related completions people produced, the more death thoughts were hovering on the fringes of their consciousness. To see if the technique worked, we had people fill in the stem words a few minutes after they responded to our usual essay questions about death. Sure enough, the folks who wrote about themselves dying produced more death-related words than those in the control condition. But would threatening people's cherished beliefs also bring thoughts of death closer to consciousness? To find out, Jeff Schimmel and his colleague at the University of Alberta brought 2 groups with very different belief systems, Canadian creationists and evolutionists, into their lab. All the study participants read a passage from an article by evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. In the text, Gould cited evidence from the fossil record that directly contradicts the creationist view. Specifically, he wrote about the walking whale, Ambulocetus, which lived 50 million years ago. This creature could walk as well as swim, proving that whales evolved from land to sea-based mammals. If you had given me both a blank sheet of paper and a blank check, Gould wrote, I could not have drawn you a theoretical intermediate any better or more convincing than Ambulocetus. Those dogmatists who can make white black and black white by verbal trickery will never be convinced by anything, but Ambulocetus is the very animal that creationists proclaimed impossible in theory. The passage undercut a central creationist claim that evolution must be wrong because there are no transitional forms or missing links connecting various species. Then everyone completed the word stem exercise. Creationists, confronted with evidence in stark opposition of their core principles, produced higher numbers of death-related words. This finding is not confined to religious beliefs. In another study, Canadians read essays that belittled either common Canadian or Australian values. The anti-Canadian essay was titled Down with Canada and opened with the statement, Everyone hates Canada, and here are a few of the reasons I do. The tirade went on to mock Canadian food, healthcare, and sports. In the US, the writer noted, hockey receives about as much attention and commands about the same fan base as monster trucking. Only Canadians care about hockey. Does the US have hockey teams? Yeah, we also have professional bowlers, billiard players, sport fishermen, and poker players. We have loads of professional athletes playing insignificant sports, like hockey. Then came the word stem task. Sure enough, Canadians pelted with condemnations of their country generated more death-related responses than those who read the comparatively nasty assault on Australians. For creationists and Canadians, inducing doubt about a central tenet of their worldviews brought the worm at the core closer to consciousness. The appalling distance. We have now seen how human infants embark on the long journey from birth to acculturated individuals in a wider array of meanings and symbols, and it is to no surprise that children perceive the world much as their elders describe it, given the enormous efforts that people undertake to modify their surroundings to fit their culture's version of reality. Indeed, cultural beliefs, values, and ideals would be hard to sustain unless they were physically reinforced by signs and symbols. Everywhere, from crucifixes and flags to public buildings to movies which masked heroes vanquish planet-threatening bad guys. The scheme of things is so deeply ingrained that virtually everything we think about, everything we think we feel and do is shaped by it. It not only provides each of us with our knowledge and explanations of the world, it also supplies the fundamental structure of our conscious experience. Right now, your current author and professor of psychology is writing this important book on Friday, October 10th, 2014 at 1:55 p.m., sitting in his office in the United States of America. What could be more meaningful than that? But if he peers from outside his cultural worldview and the meanings it provides, he sees just a warm-blooded animal pecking a piece of plastic in the midst of an undifferentiated flow of experiences that will, sooner or later, inevitably be interrupted by a heart attack, cancer, car accident, or the ravages of old age. What time is it now for you, the reader? What does it mean that it's some day of the week, some month, some year? Isn't that all an illusory structuring of your conscious experiences provided for you by your culture to help you impose order and permanence on something chaotic and fleeting? If this is a Thursday, how comforting an illusion it is that there will be another Thursday and another one after that. All of which raises the issue of why you are now reading this book. Maybe we should stop writing, and you should stop reading. But we won't stop, and we hope you won't either, because we'd rather slip back into the cultural drama in which we, American psychologists in the fall of 2014, are explaining how people cope with their existential predicament, and you, intelligent knowledge seekers that you are engaged in the meaningful pursuit of insight into the human condition and how it derives human behavior. Take all the cultural trappings away, and we are just generic creatures barraged by a continuous stream of sensations, emotions, and events, buffeted by occasional waves of existential dread, until those experiences abruptly end. But in a world infused with meaning, we are so much more than that. Still, it is not enough to be equipped with our scheme of things. We humans feel fully secure only if we consider ourselves valuable contributors to that world we believe in. To this vital striving for self-esteem, we now turn. I'm going to take a few-minute break to check things, then I'll continue with Chapter 3. Chapter 3, The Foundation of Fortitude. The seemingly trite words self-esteem are at the very core of human adaptation. They do not represent an extra self-indulgence or mere vanity, but a matter of life and death. The qualitative feeling of self-value is the basic predicate for human action. Unlike the baboon who gluts himself only on food, man nourishes himself mostly on self-esteem. Ernest Becker, The Birth and Death of Meaning. Francisco Velasquez, a freshman at the Balboa High School in San Francisco, was a pretty cool-looking guy with spiky hair and sunglasses. He also had a gnawingly empty stomach by lunchtime. The smell of oregano-tinted, cheesy, pepperoni-laced pizza and salty, oily French fries in the cafeteria drove him crazy, but he couldn't afford to pay for those tasty items. He did, however, qualify for the free government finance meal, which included an entree of chicken teriyaki. Despite this, he and most of his friends decided to not eat at all during lunch period. As it turns out, Francisco was not alone, as only 37% of eligible students were eating free lunches in San Francisco schools. Why? Federal law requires subsidized meals to have nutritional value, so junk foods like pizza, French fries, soda, and candy are sold in a different part of the cafeteria. Students eating the free lunches are well nourished, but they are also easily recognized and stigmatized by their more affluent peers, as Louis Geist, the student body president at Balboa High, explained, Accepting government assistance lowers your status because lunch is the best time to impress your peers. Kids who wear nice shoes and nice clothes don't want to be associated with food that says, I'm not able to provide for myself. For Francisco and his friends, nourishing their self-image was more important than nourishing their own body. But why would they go hungry to preserve their self-worth? We have to delve into the nature of self-esteem to find out. What is self-esteem? Self-esteem is a concept most people grasp only superficially. It means feeling good about yourself and believing that you are a worthy individual. But what does that actually mean? You might say to yourself, I feel good about myself because I'm a highly regarded member of my profession, a loyal and devoted partner and parent, and I generally try to do the right things. However, these sources of self-esteem do not spring fully formed from some deep inner self. Rather, they are a reflection of the roles and values provided by your culture's scheme of things. Your understanding of what the right things to do are, what social roles are of value, and how to properly fulfill your own role depends on your worldview. Accordingly, self-esteem is the feeling that one is a valuable participant in a meaningful universe. This feeling of personal significance is what keeps our deepest fears at bay. Since cultures vary in what they value, the very same attributes and behaviors that provide self-esteem in one time and place may diminish it in another. In the United States, 13-year-old Jewish boys often mark transition to adulthood with a bar mitzvah, involving a rather elaborate ceremony that includes singing a passage from the ancient Torah, followed by a celebration of dancing to hip-hop music and gorging on dessert. Zambian boys in Papua New Guinea mark the same transition by participating in the flute ceremony, which includes playing ritual flutes and performing fellatio on older boys and elders of their tribe. Imagine if the Zambian and American Jewish boys suddenly changed places. We'd witness how a momentous source of pride to members of one culture would be a totally meaningless or humiliating experience to members of another, because the behaviors and achievements that confer self-esteem do so only to the extent that we embrace a cultural worldview that deems them worthy. People perceive what's right and correct as obvious truths because those perceptions are shared. If everyone around you believes in the importance of the flute ceremony, there is little doubt that this is the way things are meant to be. How others react to our behavior tells us how well we are meeting the standards of our culture and ultimately whether we are really the valued people we want to be. As we saw in the previous chapter, the seeds of the link between self-esteem and psychological security are sown in early childhood. Being good and doing good become associated with parental love and protection, while being bad and doing bad become associated with anxiety and insecurity due to the prospect of losing that love and protection. Cultures then reinforce these associations throughout our lives by promising great rewards to those who do good and punishments to those who do bad, both here in this plane of earthly existence and usually in one or more subsequent ones. Living up to cultural roles and values, whether we are called doctor, lawyer, architect, artist, or beloved mother, embeds us safely in the symbolic reality in which our identity helps us transcend the limits of our fleeting biological existence. Self-esteem is thus the foundation of psychological fortitude for us all. How self-esteem buffers anxiety. Hundreds of studies have found that people with durable, high self-esteem enjoy better physical and mental health than those who haven't had a stable sense of self-worth. People who lack self-esteem struggle with anxiety as well as a host of physical, psychological, and interpersonal difficulties. This large body of evidence certainly squares with the idea that self-esteem affords psychological security. But when measured variables like self-esteem and anxiety are associated with each other, we can't be sure which way the causal arrow runs. Does low self-esteem cause anxiety, or does anxiety cause low self-esteem? In the 1970s, psychologists began trying to sort out this conundrum by looking at what happens when self-esteem is undermined. In some studies, people were told that they did poorly on an intelligence test. Sure enough, this unwelcome news reduced their self-esteem and increased their anxiety, defensiveness, and hostility. Of course, this is hardly surprising, but is the converse true? Does raising people's self-esteem shield them from anxiety? To find out, we recruited participants for an experiment billed as a study of the relationship between personality and reactions to emotionally laden stimuli. Everyone received a seemingly personalized psychological profile, supposedly based on their responses to questionnaires completed a few weeks earlier. These profiles were constructed to seem applicable to virtually everyone, but they were designed to convey either a very positive or a neutral evaluation of the recipient's personality. The neutral evaluation included statements such as, while you have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them, and some of your aspirations may be a bit unrealistic. The positive evaluation, designed to momentarily increase self-esteem, included statements such as, while you may feel that you have some personality weakness, your personality is fundamentally strong, and Most of your aspirations tend to be pretty realistic. To arouse some anxiety in half the participants, we had them watch a short clip from a grisly documentary called The Faces of Death. Banned in more than 40 countries, the film shows shocking footage of napalm bombings in Vietnam, battle scenes from World War II, an autopsy, and a death row electrocution. The other participants watched a benign, death-free film of nature scenes. Afterwards, everyone completed questionnaires that measured anxiety and self-esteem. Not surprisingly, participants who received positive personality assessments reported higher self-esteem than those who had received neutral assessments. As you might imagine, those who received neutral evaluations reported more anxiety if they watched the clip from Faces of Death than if they watched the benign clip. But those who had their self-esteem momentarily boosted reported no more anxiety after viewing the graphic depictions of death than they did than those who had looked at the nature footage. This experiment shows that self-esteem buffers anxiety, at least when people tell us how they are feeling. But talk is cheap. Maybe high self-esteem leads people to claim they are calm when really they're not. If self-esteem really blocks anxiety, does it also reduce physiological reactions that accompany anxiety? Thanks for coming in today, George, said our experimenter Mark, convincingly costumed in a white lab coat. This is a study of the relationship between mood, cognitive, and physical stimulation and physiological responses. You will soon be exposed to cognitive and physical stimulation while we measure your physiological responses. Mark motioned to a physiograph, a small machine that measures physiological arousal, and placed two small electrodes on George's fingers and a larger metal plate on his wrist. Mark then left the lab after giving George a questionnaire booklet and telling him that he would receive recorded instructions for the experiment. This is Sheldon Solomon of the psychology department speaking, the recording said. The cognitive stimulation in this study will be provided by the Thorndike anagram test, a reliable and valid measure of verbal intelligence. Recent data have shown that scores of the Thorndike predict future career success. The Thorndike consists of 20 anagrams. You will have 5 minutes to solve as many anagrams as you can. The first few were pretty easy. L-E-L-B can be bell, and F-I-R-T-U is fruit, George thought. I'm not sure about B-L-T-A-E or N-O-R-G-A, but K-A-S-T-E is steak for sure. 5 minutes later, the recording came back on. Stop. The experimenter will now come back in and prepare it for the rest of the study. Mark entered the lab and tallied George's responses. You did very well, George. 18 correct. No one in the study has gotten more than 16 right so far. This puts you in the 90th percentile. Not too shabby for a psych major, George mused as the experimenter went back to the control room for the next part of the study. The recorded instructions continued. After I'm finished giving you these instructions, there will be a 90-second waiting period during which the yellow light mounted in front of you will come on so that we can measure your physiological responses in the absence of physical stimulation. The waiting period will be followed by an experimental period during which the red light mounted in front of you will come on. The stimulation that we will be studying during the experimental period will be provided by electric shocks administered through the plate in your wrist. The shocks may be quite painful, but will cause no permanent tissue damage. Maybe I should have been an English major, George thought apprehensively. Then I wouldn't have to be in these damn studies. You will receive between 1 and 6 electric shocks delivered at random intervals by a shock generator, the recording continued. Because the shocks are generated randomly, they may come at any time in the experimental period. They may all come at the beginning of the period, or they may all come at the end of the period, or they may be evenly spaced throughout the period. The wait period will begin now. George noticed that his hands were beginning to sweat a little bit as the yellow light went on. Anticipating the shocks, he recalled the informed consent statement that he'd signed, said he could leave whenever he wanted, and still get credit for being in the study. I can take it, he thought. Then the red light went on and stayed on for 90 seconds. That minute and a half seemed like an eternity. George was relieved and then a bit surprised when the red light went off and the recording announced that the experiment was over, although he'd never received any shocks. Maybe the shock machine broke, he thought, or maybe Mark got shocked in the control room instead of me. That would be sweet. Mark came back to the lab, disconnected the electrodes, and told George that the study was designed to determine the effects of elevated self-esteem on the physiological indicators of anxiety in response to threat. Generally, the more anxious a person is, the more the person perspires, Mark explained. The electrodes on your fingers measure how quickly a small electric current moves across your skin. Because perspiration speeds up the conduction of electricity, the more you're perspiring, the faster the current moved across your skin. The backstory was this. Half the participants in the experiment did not get any feedback about their performance on the Thorndike anagram test, which we concocted for the study, so their self-esteem didn't change. The remaining participants, including George, received feedback that they did especially well on the test of verbal intelligence. George really did get 18 anagrams right, but so did just about everyone else. The average score was between 16 and 18. It wasn't true that a score of 18 was the highest in the study, or that George placed in the 90th percentile. That embellishment was added to momentarily boost George's self-esteem. Mark then went on to explain that half the participants learned that the physical stimulation for the second part of the experiment would come from the light waves from the red bulb. The others, like George, expected to receive electric shocks. We figured that watching colored light bulbs is pretty innocuous, but anticipating electrical shocks would cause considerable anxiety, except for study participants like you who were told they did really well in the test. But no one was actually shocked, because previous studies had shown that expecting shocks is just as threatening as actually receiving them. Anyway, thank you so much for helping us today, Mark said, escorting George from the lab. You're welcome, George replied. This was a cool study. Even though I didn't like the thought of being shocked, I wonder what you'll find. The findings were, in fact, astonishing. Participants who received no feedback on the anagram test perspired considerably more if they were expected to receive shocks than if they expected to see colored lights. No surprise there. However, participants like George, who received the self-esteem boost, perspired substantially less while anticipating the shocks, and were no sweatier than the participants who watched the colored lights. This is strong evidence that self-esteem keeps the physiological arousal associated with anxiety in check. Self-esteem is more than a mere mental abstraction. It is deeply felt in our bodies. Other studies have since shown that feelings of self-worth also diminish defensive reactions to thoughts of death. As we recall from Chapter 1, people who are reminded of death typically defend their worldviews by becoming especially harsh towards critics of their culture. But when Americans who are naturally high in self-esteem or who are given a self-esteem boost are reminded of their own death, they don't react negatively to those who express anti-American sentiments. Self-esteem takes the edge off our hostile reactions to people and ideas that conflict with our beliefs and values. With it, we can face things that would otherwise upset us with far more equanimity. Moreover, when self-esteem is undermined, death thoughts come more readily to mind. Recall the Christian fundamentalists generated more death-related word completions when confronted with evidence in support of evolution, and Canadians generated more death-related word completions when someone belittled their country. Threats to self-esteem has the same effect. Participants asked to describe themselves at their worst produced more death-related words than those who asked to describe themselves at their best. In other studies, people produced more death-related words after receiving low scores on a supposed IQ test or being told that they had unrealistic career goals. Taken together, these studies demonstrate that self-esteem protects us from deeply rooted physical and existential fears. Death and self-esteem striving. Senator Edward Ted Kennedy hadn't excelled as his older brother did. He was seen as the least promising of the four. His brothers all died as heroes and martyrs. Joseph Jr., a naval aviator, was killed in action over Europe on August 4, 1944, at the age of 29. John, Ted's mentor and President of the United States, was assassinated in Dallas on November 2, 1963, at the age of 46. And Robert, the insurgent candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, was assassinated in Los Angeles on June 6, 1968, at the age of 42. A year after Robert's death, in the early hours of July 19, 1969, Ted took a wrong turn and drove his car off a bridge and into an open ocean channel off Chattahoochee Island, Massachusetts. His passenger, Mary Jo Kopachin, drowned, and Kennedy pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of the accident. He had come to know a lot about death. In 1979, Ted Kennedy decided to run for the presidency as an insurgent Democratic candidate against his own party's President Jimmy Carter. He had outlived his brothers and felt ready to take on their mantle. The scandal of the Chattahoochee effectively crushed his chances of winning the nomination. Kennedy, nearly 50, was a man with several counts against him, but he set out to carve his own niche, championing the causes of the underprivileged. The Lion of the Senate fought tirelessly for the poor, the uninsured, the old, the disabled, the children, immigrants, refugees, and all the other untouchables of American society. He roared and clawed until the end of his life for their causes, and in doing so, he arguably achieved far more for them in his life than any of his older brothers did. In May 2008, Kennedy was diagnosed with a lethal form of brain cancer. From then until his death in August 2009, he devoted himself to healthcare reform. "This is the cause of my life," he told the Democratic National Convention in 2008, saying that "I've got to get this right for history." And sure enough, Senator Kennedy intensified his efforts in the last 15 months of his life to help push Congress towards ensuring that all Americans could have access to affordable health care. Ted Kennedy was a prime example of a central principle of human life. We combat mortality by striving for significance. Research has borne out the fact that we strive for a higher self-esteem in the face of mortality. After thinking about their death, Israeli soldiers whose self-esteem was strongly tied to their driving ability drove faster in a simulator. Elsewhere, those who based their self-worth on physical strength generated a stronger hand grip after they thought about death. Those who based their self-worth on physical fitness reported increased intentions to exercise, and those who based their self-worth on beauty reported greater concern about their appearance. Of course, when people aren't working out at the gym or fixing their hair in front of a mirror, they don't necessarily think of themselves as pursuing a sense of personal value. They think about the exercise machine or their hairstyle, but the need for self-esteem is constantly at work, prodding us on beneath the surface of awareness to maintain our protective shield against terror. Like bats and worms, we fight like hell when faced with physical death, but we humans go so much further. Even the slightest intimation of our mortality prods us to work harder to leave our mark on the world. We fight to prove our worth, even in the smallest of ways. Approval from our boss, a compliment from a friend, even an approving nod from a passing stranger can bolster our feelings of worthiness, while disapproval, criticism, and being ignored can send us reeling with a rush of anxiety. This unrelenting struggle to prove our value is one of the many ways that we, in the words of the poet Dylan Thomas, rage against the dying of the light. The scourge of low self-esteem. If there were any doubt that self-esteem is the dominant human motive, there would be one sure way to dispel it, Ernest Becker wrote, and that would be by showing that when people do not have self-esteem, they cannot act, they break down. What makes it difficult to acquire and maintain self-esteem, and what happens when self-esteem is lacking? There are two main ways self-esteem can break down. First, individuals or groups of people can lose faith in their cultural worldviews. Such disillusionment can be precipitated by economic upheaval, technological and scientific innovations, environmental catastrophes, wars, plagues, or unwelcome intrusions by other cultures. For example, before the arrival of the first Europeans, the Yupik people of Alaska belonged to a thriving culture ruled by deep customs, traditions, and spiritual beliefs. Their tribal and individual codes of conduct were defined what they called the Yuyarik, the way of a human being, which told each member how to behave in any situation. When the Europeans, carrying guns, germs, and steel that killed the majority of the population, imposed their Christian worldview on the Yupik, the Aboriginal people lost their identity. The medicine men grew ill and died, and with them the ancient spirit of the Eskimo and the code of the Yurikik. Everything the Yupik had believed in failed, and their whole world collapsed. Such catastrophes occurred all over the world where indigenous cultures were subject to colonization. But other circumstances can erode faith in a cultural belief system as well. Even the United States may be in the midst of such erosion in the wake of economic uncertainty, church and sports scandals, and political polarization. As of this writing, 7 in 10 Americans believe that the country is on the wrong track. 8 in 10 don't agree with the way the nation is being governed. Church attendance, even in as strongly religious a country as the United States, has steadily declined. Public schools, particularly in urban areas, are in disarray. We have lost our gods, Laura Hansen, a sociologist at Western New England University, told reporters for The Atlantic. We lost faith in the media. Remember Walter Cronkite? We lost it in our culture. You can't point to a movie star who might inspire us because we know too much about them. We lost it in politics because we know too much about politicians' lives. We've lost it, that basic sense of trust and confidence in everything. When people lose confidence in their core beliefs, they become literally disillusioned because they lack a functional blueprint of reality. Without such a map, there is no basis for determining what behaviors are appropriate or desirable, leaving no way to plot a course for self-esteem. And even when faith in the cultural scheme of things is intact, one still has to feel a valued part of it. Falling short, whether due to your ascribed place in society, your own failings, or unrealistic cultural expectations, is the second cause of struggles of self-worth. According to Hindu beliefs originating at least 1,500 years ago, the touchable castes emerged from distinct parts of a primordial being. Brahmins, the priests and teachers, came from the mouth. Kshratras, the rulers and soldiers, came from the arms. Vaisyas, or merchants and traders, came from the thighs. Sudras, or laborers, came from the feet. The achulas, or untouchables, were repudiated by the primordial being, deemed dirty and impure, and were consigned to tasks requiring physical contact with impure things such as blood, excrement, dead animals, and dirt. Untouchables were beaten if their shadows came in contact with someone from a higher caste. They carried buckets to spit in to avoid contaminating the ground. They wore bells to signal their approach. Although discrimination against untouchables is now technically illegal, Prejudice and ill treatment against them abounds. In 2003, after trying to exercise his legal right to use the village well, Girihali Mara's farm was looted, his house burned to the ground, and his wife and daughter beaten. People treat animals better than us, Mariah observed. This is not natural. Why did the gods let me be born in such a country? Self-esteem is hard to come by when people inhabit social roles that others in the cultural mainstream view negatively. The Untouchables are perhaps the most famous example of this, but here in the United States we have plenty of stigmatized groups. Many white Americans still consider African Americans to be criminal and lazy. Many men think of women as little more than hyper-emotional sex objects. People in red and blue states denigrate each other. It seems that every culture has social roles reserved for designated inferiors, and while having a socially sanctioned group of people to disparage is psychologically uplifting for those granted higher social status, there is little doubt that the people who are belittled often struggle to feel good about themselves. Finally, self-esteem plummets when cultures embrace standards of value that are unattainable for the average citizen. For example, think of the many occupational roles in contemporary American society that aren't highly regarded. If you are a baker at Safeway, you know that you are not a famed dessert chef on the Food Network, that there are thousands of other Safeway bakers around the country, all wearing the same uniform using the same recipes that you do. If you were a village baker in the 17th century Europe, people who depended on you for their daily bread appreciated your skill. If you were particularly good at producing a sweetly scented loaf or a tray of delicious buttery rolls, your reputation as the best baker in town would spread, perhaps to the surrounding villages, and you would feel a sense of ownership and pride. But today, the average baker at Safeway doesn't have much room for craftsmanship or creativity. Fellow Americans generally don't show much appreciation of their cake decorating accomplishments. Customers treat expert bakers like servants. Their paycheck doesn't express much appreciation either. American society, in particular, puts great value on attributes and achievements that are unreachable for most individuals. The cultural value of wealth and the humiliation of not having it is a source of anxiety for millions thanks to a glut of wealth-celebrating commercialism. Consider the message of a 90s-era American Express television ad. The ad portrayed a wealthy businessman trying to get home on a miserable rainy evening to see his daughter perform in her school play. When his flight was canceled, he booked a first-class seat on another flight with the American Express card, while hordes of other disconcerted travelers resigned themselves to being stranded in the airport. After landing, the businessman grabbed a wad of cash from an ATM and dashed past a clump of dejected voyagers pelted by torrential rain at a bus stop. He hopped into a limousine that arrived at the school just as the play began. The commercial ended by reminding viewers that membership has its privileges. The message was simple. You can be a person of unique value if you have enough disposable income to buy transportation luxuries that get you where you need to go when other people can't. And to achieve that, you must have an American Express card. The playwright Arthur Miller showed us the sad underbelly of this kind of cultural mirror in 1949 in his play Death of a Salesman. His protagonist, Willie Loman, has been striving all his life to become a successful traveling salesman, but as age and infirmity set in, his identity begins to slip away. The son of the man who first hired him hands him a pink slip. He's pinned his hopes on his athletic but underachieving son Biff, but Biff, too, is a failure. Desperate to bolster his own self-esteem, Willie imagines that both his self-worth and net worth to his family will increase if he commits suicide, and Biff becomes the beneficiary of his $20,000 life insurance policy. Can you imagine that magnificence with $20,000 in his pocket? Willie dreams happily. His tragic end is consummated in a self-inflicted car crash. For American women, youthful beauty remains a primary determinant of self-esteem. Young girls compare themselves to Barbie dolls and the skinny and bosomy young women they watch cavorting in music videos and magazines. They're so beautiful in everything, noted one female high school student in a recent study of media and self-concept. They have these really great bodies and have the perfect hair, the perfect boyfriend, the perfect life, they're rich and everything. In reality, the average female model these days weighs about 23% less than the typical woman, a weight that is up to 20% below what is healthy for her age and height. Models' pictures are routinely retouched to enlarge eyes, shrink ears, embellish hairlines, straighten and whiten teeth, and modify necks, waists, and legs to produce images of inhuman proportions. When impossibility is the standard, most women are bound to fall short and disparage themselves accordingly. Very few women are model thin. None stay young. Very few men have the vast resources of Donald Trump or Bill Gates, and very few men, women, or children become famous authors, movie stars, musicians, or athletes. Given such unrealistic standards of value, it's no wonder that shaky self-esteem is the norm in the United States, and it is hardly surprising that 1 in 10 Americans is clinically depressed and that so many suffer from anxiety, eating disorders, and substance abuse. These problems are, at least in part, a direct consequence of a culture that promotes rarely achievable standards of feeling worthy. Because self-esteem protects people from their deepest fears, they will do just about anything to get it. The pursuit of self-esteem is a driving force behind just about everything that people want in life. As William James puts it, a man's self is the sum total of all that he can call his. Not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes and his house, his wife and his children, his ancestors and friends, his reputation and works, his lands and horses and yacht and bank account. All these things give him the same emotions. If they wax and prosper, he feels triumphant. If they dwindle and die away, he feels cast down. Unfortunately, things don't always go the way we would like. We all experience various failures, criticisms, rejections, and embarrassments that poke holes in the protective veneer of our positive self-concept. And we shield ourselves from the anxiety that our shortcomings would otherwise produce by telling ourselves little white lies to salvage our dignity. The low grade on the test was due to the deviously deceptive questions the professor asked. The spurned romantic advance reflects the superficial taste of the object of our misguided affection. Moreover, we convince ourselves that we really don't want what we can't have. That high-paying job would have forced us to abandon our principles. Winning that award would have required us to sit through a boring awards banquet and endure endless pompous speeches. Sometimes the need for self-esteem trumps even the desire to succeed. We create barriers to our own success so that we can use them as ready-made excuses in case we fail. Of course my presentation bombed this morning, one of our students might say to himself. I was up all night partying with my friends, and it's no surprise I got a D on that test. I skipped half the classes and didn't bother to do the assigned readings. Most people, however, are more judicious in their use of self-deception. They make excuses to blunt the immediate impact of their shortcomings, but later step back and try to make adjustments. Navigating through the ups and downs of life requires a delicate balance between self-deception and honest objectivity. But achieving such balance is especially difficult for people who are unable to form secure attachments, the building blocks of stable self-esteem, as we've seen. Distant, unresponsive, or overly demanding parents can create barriers to self-esteem that cripple a person for life. Being considered an outsider or a loser in a culture that values insiders and winners makes it difficult to get out of bed, stand up straight, and go to school. And sometimes really bad things do happen. Losing a job or a relationship can challenge even the most robust self-concept. The costs of low self-esteem. The list of problems associated with low self-esteem is almost endless. Poor physical health, depression, anger, hostility, suicidal thoughts, psychosis, alcohol and substance abuse, adolescent smoking, risky sexual behavior, suicide attempts, eating disorders, self-harm, compulsive gambling, compulsive buying and cheating. Regardless of how or why self-esteem is compromised, the result is the same: suffering from high levels of anxiety. People with low self-esteem do what they can to reduce it. Some compensate for loss of meaning and self-esteem by adopting an entirely new worldview. Michael John is one of the millions who found a completely new identity by becoming an evangelical Christian. Raised by a Jewish household, Michael grew his hair long in high school and moved to Humboldt County, California. He grew large quantities of marijuana until he was arrested on drug charges and incarcerated, where he discovered the Bible and Jesus and was born again. Released from prison, Michael joined a Christian commune in Ohio, where he still resides, reporting that, "I am very content now in the love of the Lord." Following such religious conversions, people like Michael report that they have a greater meaning in life, higher self-esteem, and lower fear of death. Others cope with low self-esteem by assuming a rebellious stance. They take refuge in gangs, cults, fringe group. They become self-appointed outcasts, alienated from the mainstream. In fact, countercultural groups and cults often have their own elaborate systems of beliefs and values. They don't transcend the mainstream so much as they create a new one, providing social consensus to those in the know enough to find the truth they have to author. They reserve for themselves that special sense of righteousness that comes from rejecting a corrupt, unfair, or constraining system. Although such groups are often harmless, they can even be helpful in fomenting constructive social change. Some can create terrific harm. Think of the Bloods and Crips, the People's Temple, Heaven's Gate, and Shikuru. Korean-born Sang Hyu Cho, who had a long history of mental health problems and social isolation, demonstrated how rebellion against compromised self-esteem can also be a solo affair. In middle and high school in Virginia, Cho was routinely bullied and ridiculed. In an English class where students were asked to read aloud, Cho reluctantly started to read with a Korean accent. According to a classmate, as soon as he started reading, the whole class started laughing and pointing and saying, "Go back to China." On the morning of April 16, 2007, Cho entered a dorm at Virginia Tech where he was a student. He killed Emily Hilscher, a young student whom he may have been stalking, and Ryan Clark, a resident hall aide who tried to help her. Cho then returned to his room and grabbed video and written materials detailing his view of things, as well as another gun and more ammo. He left Virginia Tech to mail his videotape and written rants to MSNBC News from a nearby post office, then returned to campus, entered into the engineering building, and opened fire on faculty and students in a classroom, killing an additional 30 people before shooting himself to death. Do you know what it feels like to be spit on your face and have trash shoved down your throat? Do you know what it feels like to be humiliated? You had everything you wanted. Your Mercedes wasn't enough, you brats. Your golden necklaces weren't enough, you snobs. Your trust fund wasn't enough. Your vodka and cognac wasn't enough. You had everything. Cho's effort to express himself through the national media attested to his desire for recognition, to be sure, but he also wanted more than that. He sought self-esteem as well as eternal fame, a point to which we will return later, by portraying himself as a martyr who represented the meek, even comparing himself to Jesus. And he wanted to be immortalized as the most prolific school shooter ever. Although most people with low self-esteem do not become mass murderers, research confirms that low self-esteem is associated with delinquency and violent antisocial behaviors. In one particularly large-scale study of thousands of adolescents in New Zealand, low self-esteem at age 11 was predictive of a higher incidence of disobedience, lying, bullying, and fighting at age 13. Genuine and false self-esteem. Self-esteem does not ensure a successful life or great achievement. That requires innate abilities, excellent training, high levels of motivation and commitment, and persistent exertion. But self-esteem is the key to psychological security. As we have seen, it helps buffer anxiety, blunts defensive reactions to thoughts of death, makes people more resilient, and fosters physical, psychological, and interpersonal well-being. What do people with genuinely durable self-esteem act like? First of all, they are steady. They score high on self-esteem measures over a long span of time. They don't claim high self-esteem one day and low self-esteem the next. Barring extreme events such as running a red light and killing someone, this overall positive self-view is not easily shaken and does not wildly fluctuate from day to day. Such people accept change as it comes and don't spend a lot of time comparing themselves to others. When you meet them, they seem to be emotionally calm and fulfilled, confident but humble, often putting themselves in service to others or to a cause. The great cellist Yo-Yo Ma appears to be an example of someone who has this kind of genuine self-esteem. He's respected, adored really, but he never seems to translate this into self-adoration. He seems to prefer thinking of himself as a cello-like instrument himself, a vessel through which music flows. "I'm glad I have a job," he says, as if he were a happy waiter. "I'm grateful every day that I have the opportunity to be wanted and needed someplace." Sometimes you may not recognize people with genuine self-esteem because they aren't necessarily famous or working hard to get themselves noticed. But those who embody this kind of stability and wisdom are out there. People with durable self-esteem are like big, strong oak or redwood trees. Their roots firmly in the ground, they can bend with the wind. They love openly, laugh at themselves, and savor the moment. They know they have made plenty of mistakes and they own them, but they don't brood over them. They have enough self-compassion to understand that mistakes are an opportunity for learning. If they miss their flight, they don't get nasty with the person at the ticket counter. They get another ticket and wait for the next plane. In conversation, they are more interested in talking about you than about themselves. Some people, however, never develop a secure sense of self-worth in childhood and come to rely on excessive boasting and extreme defensive distortions to try to dampen existential dread. This leads to an inflated but fragile self-image that provides momentary security but requires a constant reassurance and is vulnerable to the slightest challenge. An inflated, unrealistic self-conception is usually referred to as narcissism. Sigmund Freud, following the German psychiatrist Paul Nack, named this personality type after Narcissus, the mythical figure who wasted away staring at his reflection. Narcissus was so handsome that everyone loved and desired him, but Narcissus was too proud to love anyone else. One day, Narcissus came by a clear pool and knelt down to drink from it. He had never seen his reflection before, and he fell in love with what he saw. He tried to kiss the image, but it didn't kiss him back. Eventually, he realized that he was in love with his own reflection, and knowing that his love would never be requited, starved to death, pining after the image in the pool. How do psychologists sort people with durable, high self-esteem from those with a narcissistic personality disorder? The most highly regarded and widely used measure of self-esteem, the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, contains sentences such as, I feel that I'm a person of worth, at least on an equal plane with others. I feel that I have a number of good qualities, and on the whole, I am satisfied with myself. The more people agree with these statements, the higher their self-esteem, but they don't report feeling superior to other people or a need to be admired. By contrast, the narcissistic personality inventory includes the following statements. I really like to be the center of attention. I am apt to show off if I get the chance. I insist upon getting the respect that is due me. I can make anybody believe anything I want them to, and I like having authority over people. The more strongly people agree with such statements, the more narcissistic they are. People who score high on this scale also tend to think in terms like perfect, glorious, and genius to accurately describe themselves. While narcissists sometimes report high opinions of themselves on self-esteem inventories, their self-esteem fluctuates wildly, and they make more rapid connections between words like I and myself and negative words such as hatred, evil, and filth, which psychologists use as a measure of implicit or unconscious self-esteem. By contrast, people with genuine self-esteem score high on both conscious and unconscious self-esteem measures. Narcissists are thus legends in their own minds, consciously, but at the same time, deep down, in the physiological bedrock of the unconscious, they really don't like themselves. Beneath their facade lurk deep self-doubts and feelings of inadequacy. Narcissists' unrealistically high feelings of grandiosity and low levels of self-esteem make them prone to violence and aggression when their self-views are threatened. Lacking the resources for fending off such attacks that a realistic sense of their value would provide, they lash out at others to restore their damaged sense of pride. Studies have shown that people high in narcissism but not in self-esteem are especially likely to act aggressively toward a person who they feel insults them. Other research shows that narcissistic self-esteem is associated with bullying and perhaps other forms of antisocial behavior. Moreover, narcissists are overly competitive, resent others who are successful in the same pursuits, and are disconcerted when others are clearly superior to them in some way. And they desperately cling to unrealistic images of themselves by carefully avoiding experiences that challenge their inflated self-image. For example, a narcissist who fancies himself a great runner might be at the track every day with the casual joggers in the neighborhood. He goes to great lengths to ensure the joggers know he can run faster than they can, and he works hard to solicit their admiration. But he's not likely to be found anywhere near the track when aspiring Olympic athletes drop by. Facing more able competition would paint a much less flattering picture of his actual skill, and would fail to elicit the adulation that comes from zipping past the locals. In contrast, a runner with secure self-esteem would be proud of her accomplishments, but more interested in self-improvement than winning. She would be eager to run with Olympic athletes. That way, she could get inspired, learn from them, and get an accurate gauge of their skills. The food is good. As self-conscious animals aware of the inevitability of death, we humans do not live by bread alone. Self-esteem, like the sturdy, graceful columns of the Parthenon in ancient Greece, is the foundation of fortitude. The physiological nourishment that we get from self-esteem is no less vital than the physical nourishment that we get from our daily bread. Lacking self-esteem, we are like Harry Harlow's poor monkeys, raised in isolation by wire mothers. We are persistently apprehensive, terrified by novel and unexpected events, in poor physical health, and prone to self-destructive and aggressive outbursts. Conversely, braced by self-esteem, we are encouraged and enthused, and thereby able to parry both physiological and physical adversity. Our experiment with the electrical shocks showed how self-esteem is a powerful vaccine against fear, not just psychologically, but on a deeply physiological level. Many of us will fight to preserve our self-esteem in the same way that worms and bats will fight to stay alive, because for us humans, self-esteem is our symbolic protection against death. All of which raises the question, what can we do to acquire it? One tactic is to encourage individuals to cultivate the same diversified self-concepts. After all, each of us is multifaceted. The same person can be an American Christian, lawyer, Republican, father, golfer, Indian, hosier, booster, and volunteer fireman. Different aspects of our identity correspond to different social roles, each with its own associated standards. Some of these standards are more attainable for particular individuals than others. Sure, other lawyers in the firm have more billable hours and your golf game is lamentable, but you're a great father, the go-to guy for driving the fire truck in tight spaces, and a highly regarded trustee at your church. We are all more worthy in some regards than others. By placing our physiological eggs in many different baskets, we increase the odds that we'll have durable ways to feel good about ourselves. Knowing which baskets are right for us is also important. You shouldn't aspire to become a professional opera singer if you can't carry a tune. Another approach is to foster the development of social roles and opportunities for people who would otherwise be marginalized or ostracized. Consider the case of 19-year-old Kendall Bailey, a cognitively challenged autistic American with cerebral palsy. Kendall had not fared well in conventional schools or organized sports, but life got a lot better for Kendall when he started swimming. He practiced breaststroking hard, and after he started winning Paralympic sanctioned races, his self-esteem skyrocketed. Eventually, he became one of the fastest disabled breaststrokers in the world. Kendall swam for Beijing in the 2008 Olympics for disabled athletes. The Paralympics gave Kendall and thousands of others with physical disabilities an opportunity to garner a sense of self-worth previously unavailable to prior generations of disabled individuals. A recent study of communities around the world with the highest concentration of centenarians found that their old people felt like valued members of their extended communities. We have a lot to learn from the ancients, the youth too, for that matter. Back at Balboa High School, while Francisco Velasquez and his friends went hungry, teenagers from Thailand, India, Myanmar, Hong Kong, as well as American-born Chinese, happily ate their free chicken teriyaki. Sitting with a friend from Myanmar, Amrita Bafasar, a senior from India, said she felt no stigma. It really doesn't matter, she said. The food is good. We have now seen why and how psychological equanimity depends on maintaining the belief that one is a valuable contributor to a meaningful world. But how did we humans come to rely on these protective resources, and how have worldviews developed over the course of history to help us manage the monumental problem of our own inevitable mortality? In the next 3 chapters, we will explore these questions by examining human evolution and history. This brings us to the end of part 1, and that is where I'm going to end this recording for the day. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. I also encourage you to donate to my Patreon if you like listening to me talk or like reading my blog. Peace.